The first thing that shocked everyone at the Harrington estate wasn't the scandal that was about to unfold, but what happened in complete silence at 3 in the morning. A 22-year-old man who hadn't taken a single step in his entire life was standing upright in the garden, supported only by the gentle hands of a woman who wasn't supposed to be there. For months, the wealthy Harrington family had searched for answers, spending fortunes on the best doctors in America, but nothing prepared them for what they were about to discover, because this wasn't just about a miracle cure or an impossible recovery. This was about a forbidden love that would challenge everything the high society of 1800s America believed about race, class, and what it truly means to heal a broken soul. What you're about to hear will change how you see love, determination, and the power of believing in someone when the whole world has given up on them. But before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? The morning fog hung heavy over the Harrington estate, as it had for the past 22 years, but on this particular Tuesday in March 1853, something felt different. Thomas Harrington, one of the wealthiest railroad magnates in Massachusetts, stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the groundskeepers tend to his sprawling gardens. His hands, weathered from years of business dealings, gripped a crystal tumbler of whiskey despite the early hour. Behind him, scattered across his mahogany desk, lay dozens of medical reports, each one carrying the same devastating conclusion about his son, William. Paralysis from the waist down since birth. No hope of recovery. A life sentence that had cost Thomas more money than most men would see in 10 lifetimes, yet had brought him nothing but heartbreak and false promises. The sound of wheels against hardwood flooring made Thomas close his eyes. He didn't need to turn around to know that William was positioning his wheelchair by the fireplace, as he did every morning at precisely 9 o'clock. The routine had become as predictable as the sunrise, and just as painful to witness. "Good morning, Father." William's voice carried the refined accent of his Harvard education, but Thomas could hear the underlying resignation that had settled there over the years. At 22, his son possessed one of the sharpest minds Thomas had ever encountered, yet remained trapped in a body that refused to cooperate with his ambitions. "The new housemaid starts today," Thomas said without turning around, his voice carefully controlled. He had learned long ago not to show his son the depth of his despair. William had enough burdens to carry without shouldering his father's grief as well. William's laugh was dry, humorless. "Another one? How many does that make this year? 7? 8? He wheeled closer to the window, positioning himself beside his father. "They all leave eventually, Father. They see me as either a charity case to pity or a problem too complicated to handle." Thomas finally turned to face his son, seeing not just the physical limitations, but the brilliant mind that had been forced to develop in isolation. William had read every book in their extensive library twice over, spoke 4 languages fluently, and could discuss philosophy and politics with the same eloquence as any senator. Yet society saw only the wheelchair, only the limitations. "This one is different," Thomas said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure why he believed it. Perhaps it was the way Amara had carried herself during the interview, or the fact that she hadn't looked at William with the usual mixture of pity and discomfort that most people displayed. She had asked practical questions about his daily routine, his interests, his preferences, as if he were simply another person rather than a medical curiosity. Amara Washington stepped down from the carriage with a grace that belied her humble background. At 25, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had been hard-earned through years of navigating a world that saw her as nothing more than her race and gender. Her dark skin gleamed in the morning sunlight, and her intelligent brown eyes took in every detail of the imposing Harrington mansion with careful assessment rather than intimidation. She had traveled from Virginia, where she had spent 5 years working for another wealthy family, learning not just the duties of household management, but also observing the intricate dynamics of power and privilege. What set her apart from other domestic workers wasn't just her efficiency or her education, secretly obtained through years of careful study, but her understanding of human nature in all its complexity. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, greeted her at the servants' entrance with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen many maids come and go. "You'll be responsible for the main floors, the library, and Master William's quarters," she explained, as they walked through the service corridors. "Master William is particular about his routine. He doesn't take well to changes or disruptions. Amara nodded, her mind already cataloguing the information. She had worked with difficult employers before, but something in Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested that William's challenges went beyond mere pickiness. As they approached the main floor, she could hear voices from the study, the conversation between father and son carrying clearly through the partially open door. "I don't need another nursemaid, father," William was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "You're 22 years old and you haven't left this house in 6 months, Thomas replied, his own voice strained with barely controlled emotion. "The doctors say that social interaction, physical activity within your limitations, could improve your overall health and disposition." Amara paused, her hand on the doorframe, listening to the pain in both voices. This wasn't just about physical disability, she realized. This was about a young man slowly disappearing into himself and a father watching helplessly as his son gave up on life entirely. When she finally entered the room to introduce herself, she found William positioned by the window, his profile sharp against the morning light. He was handsome in the way that privilege and good breeding often produced, with dark hair that caught the sunlight and intelligent green eyes that held far too much resignation for someone his age. "Master William, this is Amara Washington, your new housemaid," Mrs. Henderson announced with the formal tone reserved for such introductions. William turned his wheelchair to face them, and Amara felt the familiar weight of judgment and assessment that always accompanied first meetings with employers. But instead of the dismissive glance she expected, William studied her face with genuine curiosity, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't encountered before. "Miss Washington," he said with a slight nod, his voice carrying the educated inflection of his class but lacking the condescension she had experienced with other wealthy employers. "I trust Mrs. Henderson has explained my particular requirements." Amara met his gaze directly, something that seemed to surprise him. Most servants kept their eyes downcast during such interactions, but she had learned that respect earned through honest communication was far more valuable than the superficial deference that wealth often demanded. "She has explained your routine, sir, but I prefer to learn an individual's actual needs through observation and conversation rather than assumptions," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "Everyone has their own way of doing things, and I find it's better to understand the person rather than just the position." Thomas looked up from his desk, clearly intrigued by this response. Most domestic workers simply agreed with whatever instructions they were given, eager to please and avoid conflict. But Amara's answer suggested a depth of thinking that went beyond mere employment. William's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time in months, Thomas saw a flicker of genuine interest in his son's expression. "An interesting philosophy," William said slowly. "And what, Miss Washington, do you observe about my particular situation?" The question was clearly a test, designed to see if she would respond with the usual platitudes about his condition or retreat into uncomfortable silence. Amara considered her words carefully, understanding that this moment would likely determine the entire trajectory of her employment. "I observe a young man with an active mind who has been forced to live within limitations that others have defined for him," she said quietly. "I observe someone who has probably heard more opinions about what he cannot do than discussions about what he can accomplish. And I observe a person who might benefit from being treated as an individual rather than as a condition to be managed." The silence that followed her words was profound, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like the moment when a door that had been locked for years finally begins to open. Over the following weeks, Amara established herself within the household routines while carefully observing the dynamics that governed William's daily existence. What she discovered troubled her more than she had initially expected. The young man who had once been described as spirited and curious had become increasingly isolated, his world shrinking to encompass only the safe boundaries of his father's mansion. His daily routine was rigid and unchanging. Breakfast in his room at 8, reading in the library until noon, lunch served on a tray by his wheelchair, afternoon correspondence, and early retirement to his quarters. He rarely engaged with visitors, avoided social functions entirely, and seemed to have accepted his role as an invalid rather than embracing his identity as a capable individual with different physical circumstances. But during their brief interactions, Amara began to notice cracks in William's carefully constructed resignation. When she dusted the library while he read, She observed his keen interest in books about travel, exploration, and adventure. His desk held detailed maps of places he would supposedly never visit, and his journals, glimpsed briefly while cleaning, contained thoughtful observations about politics, social issues, and human nature. "You read philosophy," she commented one afternoon while organizing his bookshelf, noting the well-worn volumes of Emerson and Thoreau. William looked up from his current book, surprised by the observation. Most servants didn't comment on his reading habits, treating his intellectual pursuits as irrelevant to their duties. "I do," he replied cautiously. Are you familiar with philosophical literature?" The question was delicate, dancing around the reality that most people in her position would not have had access to such education. But Amara had spent years secretly reading every book she could access, understanding that knowledge was the only tool that could truly change her circumstances. "I've read some Emerson," she admitted. "His essay on self-reliance particularly resonated with me. The idea that we must trust ourselves rather than conforming to society's expectations of what we should be or do." William's entire posture shifted, his body language transforming from polite tolerance to genuine engagement. "You understand his argument about the foolish consistency that is the hobgoblin of little minds?" he asked, leaning forward in his wheelchair with an enthusiasm Amara hadn't seen before. For the next hour they discussed Emerson's philosophy, Thoreau's concepts of civil disobedience, and the broader questions of individual responsibility in society. William's mind proved to be as sharp and engaging as Amara had suspected, but more importantly, she saw glimpses of the passionate, curious person he had been before circumstances forced him into isolation. That evening, as Amara completed her duties in the main house, she found herself thinking about William's situation with increasing concern. She had worked for wealthy families before and understood the dynamics of privilege and power, but William's case was different. His isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional and intellectual, a gradual withdrawal from life that seemed to be accelerating rather than improving. In her small room in the servants' quarters, she sat by the window overlooking the estate gardens and considered what she had observed. William possessed intelligence, education, and resources that most people could only dream of, yet he was slowly disappearing into a life of comfortable resignation. The tragedy wasn't his physical limitations, but the way those limitations had been allowed to define and constrain every aspect of his existence. She had seen similar patterns during her previous employment in Virginia, where she had worked for a family whose son had lost his leg in a hunting accident. The young man had initially retreated into depression and isolation, but with patience, encouragement, and gradual challenges to his self-imposed limitations, he had eventually returned to an active, fulfilling life. The key had been refusing to accept his definition of what he couldn't do while respecting the reality of what he needed to accommodate. The next morning, Amara made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply maintaining William's established routine, she began introducing small variations that would challenge his assumptions about his capabilities without overwhelming his comfort zone. "Master William," she said, as she entered the library where he sat reading, "the weather is particularly fine today. Would you consider taking your reading outside to the garden terrace?" William looked up, clearly surprised by the suggestion. "I don't. The terrace has steps. My wheelchair." "There's a ramp that leads to the lower garden area," Amara replied smoothly. "It was built for deliveries, but it provides easy access. The fresh air might be beneficial, and the change of scenery could offer new inspiration for your reading." The suggestion was reasonable, practical, and carefully non-threatening, but it represented a fundamental shift from the protective isolation that had governed William's life. He hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity about the outside world and fear of the complications that leaving his controlled environment might bring. "I haven't been in the gardens it's been quite some time," he admitted quietly. "Then perhaps it's time to reacquaint yourself with your own property," Amara suggested gently. "I could accompany you. Ensure that you have everything you need for comfort." The journey to the garden terrace was more significant than either of them initially realized. For William, it represented the first voluntary venture beyond the safe confines of the house in over 8 months. For Amara, it was the beginning of a carefully planned campaign to expand the boundaries of what William believed possible for his life. The morning air was crisp with the promise of spring, and the gardens were beginning to show the first signs of renewal after the long Massachusetts winter. William's wheelchair moved smoothly along the stone pathway, but Amara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests as if preparing for some unknown difficulty. "I had forgotten how extensive the grounds are," William admitted, as they settled in a sunny spot overlooking the formal rose garden. "Father has maintained them beautifully, even though—" He paused, the unfinished thought hanging between them. "Even though you haven't been able to enjoy them," Amara completed gently, "but you're enjoying them now." They spent the morning there, William reading while Amara attended to some mending work she had brought along. But more than the change of scenery, what struck both of them was how different their interaction felt outside the formal constraints of the house. Here, surrounded by growing things and open sky, the rigid boundaries between employer and employee seemed less significant. "Miss Washington," William said during a pause in his reading, "may I ask you something personal?" Amara looked up from her needlework, noting the unusual formality of his request. Most employers simply asked whatever questions occurred to them, assuming their position gave them the right to any information they desired. "Of course, Master William. What brought you to Massachusetts? Your accent suggests you're from much farther south, and I imagine there were opportunities for employment closer to home." The question was delicate, touching on issues of race, opportunity, and the complex reasons why an educated black woman might travel so far from familiar territory to work as a domestic servant. Amara considered how much truth to share, understanding that her answer could fundamentally change the nature of their relationship. "I was seeking a position where my abilities could be fully utilized, rather than constrained by local expectations," she replied carefully. "Sometimes distance provides opportunities that proximity cannot offer." William nodded thoughtfully, and Amara realized that he understood her meaning perhaps better than most people would. After all, he was also someone whose capabilities were constantly underestimated based on superficial observations. As the days passed, their morning sessions in the garden became a regular part of William's routine, though he insisted on maintaining the fiction that these excursions were merely practical accommodations to his reading schedule, rather than acknowledgments of his growing desire for connection and stimulation. During these outdoor interludes, their conversations began to venture beyond the safe territory of literature and philosophy into more personal terrain. William spoke about his frustration with being treated as an invalid rather than an individual, while Amara shared carefully selected observations about her experiences navigating a world that made assumptions about her capabilities based on her race and gender. "It's curious," William said one afternoon while watching the gardeners work in the distance, "how society determines what we're capable of achieving before we've even had the opportunity to try." Amara looked up from the household accounts she was reviewing, recognizing the deeper implications of his comment. "Perhaps the more important question is how we decide what we're capable of achieving, regardless of what society believes." "But surely there are practical limitations," William replied, gesturing toward his wheelchair. "Some barriers are real, not simply matters of perception or prejudice." "Certainly," Amara agreed, "but I've observed that real limitations often become excuses for imaginary ones. The challenge is distinguishing between what truly cannot be done and what merely seems difficult or unconventional." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Harrington, who had been watching from his study window with growing amazement at his son's transformation. William's color had improved dramatically, his posture was more alert, and most significantly, he was engaging with life again rather than simply enduring it. "Good afternoon," Thomas said as he joined them on the terrace. "I trust you're both enjoying this fine weather." "Father, we were just discussing the nature of limitations," William said, and Thomas was struck by the animation in his son's voice. "Miss Washington was making some interesting observations about the difference between actual barriers and perceived impossibilities." Thomas looked at Amara with new interest, beginning to understand that her influence on his son went far beyond the typical duties of domestic service. "And what conclusions have you reached in this philosophical discussion?" "That perhaps the greatest limitation is the assumption that our current circumstances must define our future possibilities," Amara replied, her words carefully chosen to avoid overstepping the boundaries of her position while still contributing meaningfully to the conversation. 2 weeks later, while cleaning William's private study, Amara made a discovery that changed everything she thought she understood about his condition. Hidden beneath a stack of correspondence was a leather-bound journal, and its pages contained detailed exercises, stretches, and physical therapy techniques that William had been secretly attempting on his own. The handwriting revealed months of careful documentation. Attempted to move left leg using concentrated effort. Minimal response, but slight sensation noted. Tried supporting weight on arms while transferring from wheelchair to bed. Managed 3 seconds of partial weight bearing. Sensation in lower extremities varies considerably depending on weather, time of day, and emotional state. What struck Amara most profoundly was not just the evidence of William's private struggles, but the methodical, scientific approach he had taken to understanding his own condition. He wasn't simply accepting medical pronouncements about his limitations. He was conducting his own research, testing boundaries and documenting results with the same intellectual rigor he applied to his philosophical studies. But more heartbreaking than his solitary efforts was the tone of growing frustration that emerged in later entries. Father hired another specialist today, Dr. Morrison from Boston. Same conclusions as all the others. Beginning to think I'm pursuing false hope. Perhaps it's time to accept that this is simply my reality and stop fighting against it. That evening, as she prepared to leave William's quarters after completing her duties, Amara made a decision that would irrevocably alter both their lives. Instead of pretending ignorance about what she had discovered, she chose honesty and direct engagement. "Master William," she said quietly, "I noticed your journal while cleaning your desk. I apologize for the intrusion, but I couldn't help observing your therapeutic experiments." William's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, his hands moving instinctively to close the journal she had inadvertently left visible. "You had no right to read my private writings," he said sharply, but his voice carried more shame than genuine indignation. "You're absolutely correct, and I apologize," Amara replied sincerely. "But what I observed suggests that you've been conducting your recovery efforts without proper guidance or support. That seems both admirable in its determination and potentially counterproductive in its isolation." William was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with the exposure of his most private hopes and efforts. Finally, he looked up at her, with an expression that mixed vulnerability with desperate curiosity. "You think my efforts are admirable rather than foolish?" he asked quietly. "I think your efforts demonstrate exactly the kind of self-reliance and intellectual honesty that Emerson wrote about," Amara replied, settling into the chair across from William's desk. "But I also think you've been approaching this challenge with the same isolation that has characterized the rest of your life." William studied her face, trying to discern whether she was offering genuine partnership or merely another form of well-meaning pity. "What would you suggest differently?" he asked carefully. "In Virginia, I worked with a young man who had lost his leg in a hunting accident," Amara began, and William immediately tensed, preparing for another inspirational story about overcoming disability through positive thinking. But her next words surprised him. "The first thing I learned was that his condition was completely different from yours, and that any techniques that helped him might be entirely irrelevant to your situation. The second thing I learned was that recovery, when it's possible at all, requires both careful attention to physical realities and willingness to challenge assumptions about what those realities mean." She paused, measuring William's response before continuing. "Your journal suggests that you've experienced some sensation and limited movement that your doctors might not have detected or might have dismissed as insignificant. But you've been exploring these possibilities entirely alone, which limits both your techniques and your ability to measure progress objectively." William leaned forward, his entire posture conveying intense attention. "Are you suggesting that you have knowledge of therapeutic techniques that might be more effective than what I've been attempting?" "I'm suggesting that I have experience observing and assisting with physical rehabilitation, and that two minds working together might achieve more than one mind working in isolation," Amara replied carefully. "But I'm also suggesting that any such collaboration would require complete honesty about your condition, your goals, and the realistic possibilities for improvement." The conversation that followed lasted until well past midnight. William described in detail the sensations he had been experiencing, the limited movements he had achieved, and the techniques he had derived from medical texts he had secretly acquired. Amara shared her observations about rehabilitation techniques she had witnessed, the importance of gradual progression, and the psychological aspects of physical recovery. Most importantly, they established the foundation for a partnership based on mutual respect, intellectual honesty, and shared commitment to exploring possibilities rather than accepting limitations. What began 3 weeks later could hardly be called conventional physical therapy. In the early hours before dawn, when the household staff was still sleeping and Thomas was not yet awake, Amara and William met in his private quarters to explore the boundaries of what his body could and could not achieve. Their approach was methodical and scientific. Each session began with careful assessment of William's condition on that particular day, recognizing that his physical capabilities fluctuated based on various factors, including weather, stress levels, and sleep quality. They documented everything: which exercises produced results, which techniques seemed counterproductive, and how external factors influenced his response to different treatments. The key, Amara explained during their fourth session, is distinguishing between protective limitations and actual impossibilities. Your body may be preventing certain movements, not because they're impossible, but because it's trying to avoid potential injury. She guided William through a series of gentle stretches designed to maintain flexibility in his lower extremities, while gradually encouraging muscle memory and neural pathways that might still be functional. Her touch was professional and confident, treating his body with the same matter-of-fact respect she would show any person working to improve their physical condition. "I can feel something," William said quietly during a particularly focused exercise. "It's not movement exactly, but it's awareness, as if parts of my body are remembering that they exist." These sessions became the foundation for a relationship that transcended the traditional boundaries between employer and employee. Here, in the quiet intimacy of early morning collaboration, they were simply two people working together toward a common goal. The artificial hierarchies of race and class seemed irrelevant compared to the immediate realities of physical challenge and shared determination. But more than the physical work, these sessions provided William with something he had never experienced: a partner who believed in his capabilities without dismissing his limitations, who challenged him without overwhelming him, and who treated his goals as worthy of serious effort rather than kind indulgence. "Miss Washington," he said after a particularly successful session in which he had maintained muscle tension in his legs for nearly 30 seconds, "I need you to understand that regardless of whether this leads to any dramatic recovery, you've already given me something invaluable." "What's that?" Amara asked, helping him settle back into his wheelchair. "You've given me back my sense of agency over my own life." 6 weeks after their secret sessions began, the impossible happened. During what had started as a routine morning exercise, William managed to lift his right leg, nearly 6 inches off the footrest of his wheelchair, and hold the position for almost 10 seconds. Both of them stared at his leg in stunned silence, afraid that acknowledging what they had witnessed might somehow make it disappear. The movement had been deliberate, controlled, and undeniably real. "Did I actually—" William began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did," Amara confirmed, her own voice tight with emotion. "You lifted your leg entirely under your own power." The implications of this moment were staggering. Every medical expert who had examined William had concluded that such movement was impossible, given the nature of his condition. Yet here was undeniable evidence that some neural pathways remained functional, that some muscle control could be recovered through careful, patient work. But even more significant than the physical achievement was what it represented psychologically. For the first time in his adult life, William had concrete proof that his body was capable of exceeding the limitations that medical science had imposed upon it. "We need to document this carefully," Amara said, moving to William's desk to record the details in their shared journal. Time of day, weather conditions, which exercises preceded the movement, how long you were able to maintain the position. As she wrote, William attempted the movement again, concentrating intensely on the sensations in his leg. This time he managed to lift it slightly higher and hold it for nearly 15 seconds before fatigue set in. "This changes everything," he said, and Amara could hear both hope and fear in his voice. Hope because the movement proved that recovery might be possible. Fear because hope was a dangerous thing for someone who had learned to live with disappointment. "This changes our approach to the work we're doing," Amara replied carefully. "But we must be realistic about what it means and what it doesn't mean. One movement, even a significant one, doesn't guarantee full recovery or even continued progress." William nodded, but his expression had transformed completely. The resignation that had characterized his demeanor for months was gone, replaced by a focused determination that reminded Amara of the intelligent, passionate person she had glimpsed during their philosophical discussions. "What's our next step?" he asked, and the pronoun choice wasn't lost on either of them. As William's physical improvements continued, so did the complexity of his relationship with Amara. What had begun as a professional arrangement had evolved into an intellectual partnership, and now was becoming something far more dangerous in the context of their social circumstances. The problem wasn't just the growing attraction they both felt, though that was undeniably present. The deeper issue was the way their collaboration had created a level of intimacy and mutual respect that transcended every social boundary that governed their world. During their morning sessions, Amara's hands on William's legs were purely therapeutic, but the trust required for such contact had created an emotional connection that extended far beyond the physical work they were doing. When she guided him through exercises, when she encouraged him through difficult moments, when she celebrated his victories with genuine joy, they were relating to each other as equals in ways that their society would consider not just inappropriate, but potentially criminal. "Miss Washington," William said one morning after a particularly successful session in which he had managed to move both legs simultaneously, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Amara looked up from the notes she was making, recognizing the serious tone in his voice. "Are you aware that what we're doing here extends far beyond any conventional employment arrangement?" he asked quietly. "Are you conscious of the complications that our partnership might create?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Both of them understood the implications. A wealthy white man and a black domestic worker developing a relationship based on equality and mutual respect was dangerous territory in 1853 Massachusetts, regardless of how innocent or professional their interactions might be. "I'm aware," Amara replied slowly, "that we've created something unique and valuable, and that unique and valuable things often require careful protection. But are you also aware," William continued, "that my feelings toward you have evolved beyond gratitude, beyond professional appreciation, into something that could put us both in considerable danger?" The admission hung in the air between them, transforming their careful partnership into something that required immediate decisions about boundaries, risks, and the price they were willing to pay for emotional honesty. Amara met his gaze directly, her decision made. "I'm aware that my feelings toward you have undergone a similar evolution," she replied quietly, "and I'm also aware that we must decide whether to retreat to safer ground or acknowledge that some things are worth the risks they entail." That afternoon, as they sat in the garden where their friendship had first begun to develop, William made a decision that would irrevocably alter both their lives. The warm May sunshine filtered through the oak trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex emotions playing across both their faces. "Amara," he said, using her first name deliberately for the first time, "I need to tell you something that goes far beyond our work together, something that I understand might change everything between us." She turned to face him fully, recognizing that they had reached a moment that would define not just their relationship, but their individual futures as well. "I have fallen in love with you," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a confession that could destroy them both. "Not with the idea of you, not with what you've done for me physically, but with who you are as a person. Your intelligence, your strength, your compassion, your unwillingness to accept limitations that others try to impose." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the magnitude of what he had just risked. In their world, such a declaration wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was potentially lethal for both of them. Amara studied his face, seeing not the wealthy invalid she had been hired to assist, but the man who had shared his deepest fears and dreams with her, who had trusted her with his most vulnerable moments, who had treated her as an equal, even when society demanded otherwise. "William," she said softly, her use of his first name carrying its own significance, "I have been in love with you for weeks, but I didn't dare acknowledge it even to myself, let alone speak it aloud." The admission transformed the space between them, making their garden sanctuary feel both more intimate and more dangerous. They were no longer employee and employer pretending to appropriate boundaries. They were two people who had found in each other something rare and precious and utterly forbidden. "What do we do now?" William asked, and his voice carried all the vulnerability of someone who had just gambled everything on a single moment of truth. Now we decide whether love is worth the price it will demand, Amara replied, reaching across the space between them to take his hand. Because make no mistake, William, choosing to love each other means choosing to defy every expectation our society has for people like us. Their fingers intertwined, and in that simple gesture they crossed a line that neither law nor social custom would permit them to retreat behind. What followed was a courtship conducted in shadows and stolen moments, a love affair that required constant vigilance and careful choreography to avoid detection. Their morning therapy sessions became not just times for physical rehabilitation, but opportunities for emotional intimacy that they could achieve nowhere else. In the pre-dawn darkness of William's quarters, they discovered each other not just as partners in his recovery, but as individuals whose minds and hearts were perfectly matched despite every social barrier designed to keep them apart. Their conversations ranged across literature, philosophy, politics, and dreams for a future that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. "If we lived in a different world," William said one morning, as Amara helped him through exercises that had progressed remarkably since their relationship deepened, "what would you want to do with your life?" The question was both hypothetical and achingly real, touching on dreams that Amara had never dared voice aloud. "I would want to teach," she replied without hesitation, "not just children, but adults who have been denied education because of their race or economic circumstances. I would want to prove that intelligence and capability exist everywhere, not just in the privileged classes." William listened intently, understanding that she was sharing not just dreams, but fundamental aspects of her identity that their society refused to recognize or value. "You would be a remarkable teacher," he said seriously. "You've certainly transformed my understanding of what I'm capable of achieving." Their relationship existed in a bubble of secrecy that made every moment together feel both precious and precarious. They developed elaborate systems for communication, using their official interactions to convey personal messages that no one else could decipher. When Amara arranged books on William's desk, their positioning conveyed messages about when they could next meet privately. When William requested specific meals or household arrangements, his choices contained coded information about his feelings and concerns. The physical intimacy of his therapy sessions provided cover for emotional intimacy that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. When Amara's hands worked to strengthen his legs, they were also expressing tenderness that couldn't be shown in any other context. When William trusted her with his physical vulnerability, he was also demonstrating an emotional trust that transcended every barrier their society had constructed. "I never understood," he confided during one particularly intense session, "how much courage it requires simply to love someone completely." As summer progressed, William's physical improvements became impossible to hide from the household staff. He was moving with greater confidence, showing more energy and enthusiasm for life, and most tellingly, he had begun venturing outside his usual routines without assistance or encouragement. Thomas Harrington observed these changes with a mixture of joy and bewilderment. His son, who had been gradually withdrawing from life for years, was suddenly engaged, alert, and optimistic in ways that no medical treatment had ever achieved. But Thomas was also a shrewd businessman who hadn't built his fortune by ignoring significant changes in his environment. "Mrs. Henderson," he said one afternoon, summoning the head housekeeper to his study, "I've noticed remarkable improvements in William's condition and disposition. Have you observed anything unusual in his daily routines or interactions with the staff?" Mrs. Henderson, who had been managing the Harrington household for 15 years, chose her words carefully. She had indeed noticed the correlation between William's improvement and Amara's arrival, but she had also observed the increasing intimacy of their interactions in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. "The new maid, Amara, has been very attentive to Master William's needs," she replied diplomatically. "She spends considerable time ensuring his comfort and seems to have a calming influence on his temperament." Thomas nodded, but something in Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested that she was withholding information. "Is there anything specific about her methods that differs from previous domestic staff?" "She treats him more as an individual than an invalid, sir. She engages him in conversation, encourages his interests, spends time with him beyond the basic requirements of her position." Mrs. Henderson paused, clearly debating whether to voice her growing concerns. Perhaps more time than is entirely conventional for a domestic arrangement. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Thomas felt a cold dread settling in his stomach, not because he disapproved of his son's improvement, but because he understood the dangerous territory that such improvements might indicate. That evening, Thomas began his own careful investigation of the relationship between his son and Amara. He observed their interactions during regular household activities, noting the way they looked at each other, the subtle communications that passed between them, and most tellingly, the way both of them seemed to come alive in each other's presence. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears and his greatest hopes simultaneously. His son was clearly in love, genuinely and completely in love, for the first time in his adult life. But the object of that love was precisely the person who could destroy everything Thomas had worked to build for his family. William's physical improvements were remarkable and undeniable. He was moving his legs with increasing control, showing greater strength and coordination, and demonstrating a level of determination that no medical professional had been able to inspire. But these improvements were clearly connected to his emotional state, which meant they were dependent on his relationship with Amara. The dilemma was impossible. Thomas could separate them and likely see his son return to his previous state of despair and deterioration, or he could allow the relationship to continue and risk social, economic, and potentially legal consequences that could destroy the family's reputation and fortune. "William," he said the next morning, entering the library where his son sat reading with an alertness and engagement that had been absent for years, "I'd like to discuss your recent improvements with you." William looked up, and Thomas was struck by how much his son's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the resignation and withdrawal. In their place was a vitality and purpose that transformed his appearance completely. "I'm pleased that you've noticed," William replied carefully, clearly sensing the serious tone of his father's approach. "I've noticed more than just your physical improvements," Thomas said quietly, settling into the chair across from his son. "I've also noticed the source of those improvements, and I'm concerned about the implications." The words hung between them like a challenge, both of them understanding that this conversation would determine not just their relationship, but the entire future trajectory of William's life. "Father," William said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to risk, "if you're referring to my feelings for Amara, then yes, I believe you should know that I love her completely and that she returns my affection." Thomas felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his chair. Despite his suspicions, hearing his son openly acknowledge a romantic relationship with their black housemaid was staggering in its implications. In Massachusetts in 1853, such relationships weren't just socially unacceptable, they could result in violence, legal persecution, and complete social ostracism. "William," he said, struggling to keep his voice controlled, "do you understand what you're saying? Do you comprehend the consequences of what you're describing?" "I understand that I'm describing the first genuine happiness I've experienced since childhood," William replied with a calm that surprised them both. "I understand that I'm talking about a woman who has given me back not just hope for physical recovery, but reasons to want that recovery. I understand that our society considers such feelings inappropriate, but I also understand that some things transcend social conventions." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had watched his son's transformation unfold. "And what of her position? What of her safety? What of the danger you're placing her in by pursuing this attachment?" "Amara and I have discussed these concerns extensively," William said, his voice growing firmer. "We're both aware of the risks, and we've both decided that love worth having is worth the complications it creates." The statement hung in the air with the weight of an ultimatum. Thomas recognized that his son was no longer the dependent invalid who could be managed and protected through paternal authority. William had become a man making his own choices, regardless of their consequences. "And what exactly do you propose to do about these feelings?" Thomas asked, turning back to face his son. "You cannot marry her legally. You cannot acknowledge the relationship publicly. You cannot build a life together within the bounds of law or society." William's response shocked him with its directness and certainty. "Then perhaps it's time to consider living outside those bounds." The words represented more than just romantic rebellion. They constituted a fundamental rejection of everything Thomas had assumed about his son's future and his family's place in society. "You would risk everything," Thomas said quietly. Your inheritance, your social position, your safety and hers, for a relationship that society will never accept? I would risk everything, William replied without hesitation, to become the man I'm capable of being, rather than remaining the invalid that circumstances tried to make me. The conversation between father and son continued for hours, evolving from confrontation into something approaching negotiation. Thomas was torn between his genuine desire for his son's happiness and his terror of the social and economic consequences that William's choices would inevitably bring. There might be, Thomas said slowly, the words emerging as if against his will, alternatives to complete social disaster. William leaned forward, hope and caution warring in his expression. I have business interests in California, Thomas continued, in areas where social conventions are more flexible than they are here in Massachusetts, communities where a man's past matters less than his present capabilities, where unusual circumstances are more easily accommodated. The suggestion was radical beyond anything William had dared hope for. California was still largely frontier territory, where traditional social hierarchies were less rigidly enforced and where couples like him and Amara might find acceptance impossible in established Eastern society. You would consider such a drastic step? William asked, hardly believing what he was hearing. I would consider preserving my son's life and happiness through whatever means prove necessary, Thomas replied quietly. But such arrangements would require careful planning, considerable financial resources, and absolute discretion until everything could be properly established. The proposal transformed their impossible situation into something approaching a viable solution. If Thomas could establish William in a California business venture, if appropriate living arrangements could be made, if the transition could be managed without creating scandal in Massachusetts, then perhaps the relationship with Amara could continue without destroying everyone involved. What would this require from me? William asked. Complete secrecy until arrangements are finalized, Thomas replied. Absolute discretion in your current interactions with Amara, and patience while I determine whether such a plan is actually feasible. William nodded, understanding that his father was taking enormous personal and financial risks to make this possibility available. And what would it require from Amara? The same discretion, the same patience, and ultimately the courage to leave behind everything familiar to build a life in unfamiliar territory, Thomas said. This is not a decision that should be made lightly or quickly. But even as he spoke, Thomas recognized that the decision had already been made, at least in William's mind. His son had found something worth any sacrifice, and no amount of practical concern was going to dissuade him from pursuing it. Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into the complex logistics of relocating his son's entire life to California, while maintaining the fiction that nothing unusual was happening in the Harrington household. He corresponded with business associates in San Francisco, investigated property opportunities in areas where mixed-race couples might find acceptance, and began the delicate process of liquidating some of his Eastern investments without attracting unwanted attention. Meanwhile, William and Amara continued their morning therapy sessions, but now their physical work was accompanied by careful planning for a future that seemed both impossible and increasingly real. William's improvements had progressed to the point where he could stand for several minutes at a time with minimal support, and could take halting steps between his wheelchair and nearby furniture. If we do this, Amara said one morning, as she helped him through exercises that had become as much about building strength for their future as recovering from his past limitations, there will be no returning to the safety of known circumstances. The safety of known circumstances, William replied, has been slowly killing me for years. I'd rather risk everything for the possibility of actually living than continue existing in comfortable despair. Their conversations during these sessions focused increasingly on practical preparations for their potential new life. William shared everything his father had discovered about opportunities in California, while Amara contributed her own research about communities where their relationship might find acceptance. But beneath their planning lay a deeper current of anticipation and fear. They were discussing not just a change of location, but a fundamental transformation of their identities. In Massachusetts, they were employer and employee, maintaining a dangerous secret. In California, they would be partners building a life together as equals, but without the social structures and family connections that had always defined their individual existences. Are you afraid? William asked one morning, after a particularly successful session in which he had walked nearly 10 steps without assistance. Terrified, Amara replied honestly, but not of the practical challenges or even the social disapproval. I'm afraid of hoping for something this significant and then discovering it was too good to be true. William reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed over months of shared vulnerability and trust. Then we'll be afraid together, he said simply, and we'll prove to ourselves and to the world that some things are worth whatever courage they require. In early September, their carefully constructed secrecy was put to the ultimate test when Thomas announced that a prominent Boston physician, Dr. Nathaniel Morrison, would be visiting to assess William's remarkable improvement and potentially document his recovery methods for medical publication. The visit represented both an opportunity and a catastrophic threat. If Dr. Morrison could be convinced that William's improvements were the result of conventional medical techniques, it would provide perfect cover for their unconventional relationship. But if he detected the true nature of their partnership, it could expose everything they had worked to build and protect. We must be absolutely conventional during his visit, William told Amara as they planned their strategy. You'll need to appear as nothing more than a competent domestic worker, and I'll need to attribute my improvements to independent effort and determination. The deception required them to suppress every aspect of the intimacy and partnership that had made his recovery possible. For 3 days, they returned to the rigid employer-employee boundaries they had transcended months earlier, interacting only in ways that would appear completely appropriate to external observation. Dr. Morrison was impressed by William's physical improvements, but puzzled by their extent and consistency. "Young man," he said during his examination, "your progress defies every medical prediction that was made about your condition. What specific techniques have you employed to achieve such remarkable results?" William's response was carefully prepared and meticulously truthful, without revealing anything about Amara's role. He described the exercises, the gradual progression of his efforts, and the psychological factors that had motivated his determination, all while presenting these achievements as entirely self-directed. "And your domestic staff has been properly supportive of your therapeutic efforts?" Dr. Morrison inquired, his question carrying implications that made both William and Amara tense, despite their careful preparation. "Miss Washington has been exemplary in maintaining my comfort and accommodating my changing needs," William replied formally. "Her efficiency and discretion have allowed me to focus entirely on my recovery efforts." The words were accurate but felt like betrayal to both of them, reducing their profound partnership to conventional employer satisfaction with domestic service. After Dr. Morrison's departure, William and Amara found themselves facing a moment of truth that would determine everything about their future. The strain of pretending indifference to each other had been more difficult than either had anticipated, and the experience had forced them to confront the full magnitude of what they were choosing to pursue. "I can't do that again," William said as they sat in their garden sanctuary the evening after the doctor's visit. "I can't pretend that you're merely an employee when you're the most important person in my life. I can't reduce what we've built together to conventional employer satisfaction." Amara nodded, feeling the same emotional exhaustion from their forced deception. "Then we need to decide whether we're ready to stop pretending and start living according to our own truth rather than society's expectations." That night, William made a decision that would change everything. He wrote a letter to his father, formally requesting that the California plans be accelerated, regardless of remaining obstacles or incomplete preparations. He was no longer willing to wait for perfect circumstances. He was ready to create the circumstances he needed through his own actions and choices. Thomas found the letter on his desk the next morning, along with a detailed proposal that William had spent weeks developing. His son wasn't just asking to be rescued from his circumstances. He was presenting a comprehensive business plan for establishing himself in California, complete with financial projections, market analysis, and partnership opportunities that would make him a valuable contributor to Thomas's Western investments, rather than simply a dependent being accommodated. "You've been planning this for some time," Thomas observed when he met with William later that morning. "I've been planning this since the day I realized that Amara had given me back my life," William replied without apology. "The only question was whether you would support the plan or whether I would need to implement it independently." Thomas studied his son's face, seeing determination that reminded him of his own younger self when he had been building the foundation of the family's fortune through calculated risks and unconventional strategies. And Miss Washington, have you discussed these plans with her? Is she prepared for what such a dramatic change would require? She's been part of developing these plans from the beginning, William answered. This isn't something I'm asking her to accept. This is something we're choosing to build together. The distinction was crucial, and Thomas recognized its significance. His son wasn't pursuing a romantic infatuation that overrode practical considerations. He was entering into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and careful planning. That afternoon, Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of continuing to treat Amara as merely a domestic employee whose personal life was irrelevant to family business, he requested a formal meeting with her to discuss the proposed California venture directly. Miss Washington, he began as she sat across from his desk in the same chair where she had been interviewed for her original position, my son has proposed a significant business relocation that would apparently involve your participation as more than an employee. Amara met his gaze directly, recognizing that this conversation would determine whether their carefully planned future would receive family support or would need to be pursued against family opposition. Yes, sir, she replied simply, offering neither justification nor apology for her relationship with William. Before I commit substantial financial resources to this venture, Thomas continued, I need to understand your motivations, your capabilities, and your commitment to what would be a permanent and irreversible life change. What followed was the most honest conversation Thomas had ever had with someone of Amara's social position. She spoke about her education, acquired through years of careful study and observation. She described her goals for contributing to their California business venture, not as William's dependent, but as a partner with valuable skills and insights. She explained her understanding of the challenges they would face and her willingness to accept the risks those challenges would entail. Most importantly, she demonstrated the same intelligent determination that had made William's recovery possible, but now directed toward building a sustainable future rather than simply overcoming immediate obstacles. You understand, Thomas said after listening to her detailed responses, that if this arrangement fails, if the social pressures prove too difficult, if the business ventures don't succeed, there will be no returning to the comfort and security of your current position. I understand, Amara replied, that comfort and security without the possibility of genuine happiness are ultimately forms of imprisonment, regardless of how pleasant the accommodations might be. Thomas leaned back in his chair, struck by the parallel between her words and the philosophy that had guided his own business decisions for decades. He had built his fortune by recognizing opportunities that others dismissed, by taking calculated risks that conventional wisdom would have avoided. Very well, he said finally. If you're both prepared to risk everything for this venture, then I'm prepared to make it possible. The following months were a whirlwind of careful preparation and concealed excitement. Thomas's business connections in California proved more extensive and promising than any of them had initially hoped, and by October, he had secured not just a business opportunity for William, but a genuine partnership in a growing freight and transportation company that connected San Francisco with the expanding mining territories. William's physical improvements continued at a remarkable pace, motivated by the prospect of building an active life in California rather than simply managing a limited existence in Massachusetts. By November, he was walking with minimal assistance for distances that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, and his overall health and vitality had improved beyond anything the doctors had predicted. But the most significant preparation was emotional and psychological. William and Amara spent hours discussing not just the practical aspects of their future life, but the fundamental changes in identity that their move would represent. In California, Amara would not be a domestic employee pretending to social invisibility. She would be William's acknowledged partner in both business and personal life. I've never lived as anything other than someone's servant, she confided one morning, as they completed what would be one of their last therapy sessions in the familiar surroundings of the Harrington estate. I'm not sure I know how to be a person whose opinions and decisions matter in their own right. And I've never lived as anything other than an invalid whose capabilities were defined by his limitations, William replied. We'll learn together how to be the people we're capable of becoming, rather than the people our circumstances have forced us to be. Their conversations during this period revealed the depth of understanding they had developed about each other's fears, hopes, and dreams. They planned not just their immediate relocation, but their long-term goals for building a life that would be meaningful and productive, despite its unconventional foundation. Thomas, meanwhile, was discovering that arranging his son's new life required him to examine his own assumptions about social conventions, racial relationships, and the nature of family loyalty. Supporting William's choices meant challenging beliefs he had never questioned, but seeing his son's transformation made those challenges seem necessary rather than merely difficult. "You've changed as much as he has," Mrs. Henderson observed one afternoon as she watched Thomas reviewing the latest correspondence from his California associates. "Perhaps," Thomas replied, "changing was the only way to avoid losing him entirely." In December, 3 weeks before their planned departure for California, William and Amara made a decision that shocked even Thomas with its boldness. They arranged to be married in a quiet ceremony, performed by a progressive minister in a predominantly black church in Boston's North End, far from the social circles that would recognize either of them. The wedding was attended only by Thomas, who had chosen to support his son's decision despite his concerns about its legal and social implications, and by Mrs. Henderson, who had gradually come to respect the genuine love she had observed between William and Amara. "I never thought I would see the day," Thomas murmured to Mrs. Henderson, as they watched his son exchange vows with a woman who had transformed his life in ways that went far beyond physical recovery. "Nor I," Mrs. Henderson replied, "but I've also never seen Master William look so completely happy and alive." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving, focusing on the commitment William and Amara were making, not just to each other, but to building a life based on equality, mutual respect, and shared dreams, rather than conventional social expectations. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the moment felt like both an ending and a beginning. They were concluding their life in Massachusetts, with all its limitations and constraints, and beginning their life in California, with all its uncertainties and possibilities. "Mrs. Harrington," William said as they stood together after the ceremony, using Amara's married name for the first time. "Mr. Harrington," she replied, and both of them felt the power of claiming an identity that society would refuse to recognize, but that they would live according to their own terms. Thomas embraced them both, understanding that he was not just supporting his son's marriage, but endorsing a fundamental challenge to the racial and social hierarchies that had governed his world. "Welcome to the family," he told Amara, and the words carried weight that went far beyond conventional politeness. That evening, as they celebrated quietly in the privacy of William's quarters, now transformed into their shared space, they reflected on how much their lives had changed since that first morning when Amara had suggested taking William's reading outside to the garden. "No regrets?" William asked as they sat together by the fireplace, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that was now legally and morally their right, rather than a dangerous secret. "No regrets," Amara replied. "Only anticipation for everything we're going to build together." Their departure from Massachusetts in January 1854 was deliberately quiet and unremarkable. To avoid the social complications that a dramatic farewell might create, they left as if William were simply traveling to California for business reasons, with Amara accompanying him as a domestic assistant, just as countless wealthy men traveled with their household staff. Only Thomas and Mrs. Henderson knew the true nature of their journey and their relationship. To everyone else, including the business associates and social acquaintances who had observed William's remarkable recovery, his trip west appeared to be a natural extension of his improved health and renewed interest in active pursuits. The journey itself was transformative in ways none of them had anticipated. As their train carried them farther from the rigid social structures of New England, William and Amara felt the gradual lifting of constraints that had governed their every interaction. By the time they reached Chicago, they were able to travel openly as a married couple, staying in hotels that accommodated mixed-race partnerships and dining in restaurants where their relationship attracted curiosity rather than hostility. William's physical condition continued to improve during the journey, strengthened by the excitement of travel and the prospect of building an entirely new life. By the time they reached St. Louis, He was walking distances that would have been impossible just months earlier, supported only by a walking stick, rather than requiring his wheelchair for any significant mobility. "I feel like I'm becoming a completely different person," he told Amara as they stood together on the observation platform of their train, watching the American landscape roll past them in all its vast possibility. "You're becoming the person you always were," she replied, "but who never had the opportunity to develop until now." Their conversations during the long days of travel focused increasingly on their plans for California. Thomas had arranged for William to join a freight company that specialized in transporting goods between San Francisco and the mining camps in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was demanding work that would require both physical stamina and business acumen, but it offered the possibility of genuine partnership and eventual ownership rather than merely employment. For Amara, California represented the first opportunity in her life to develop her intellectual capabilities without the constraints imposed by her race and gender in more established social environments. She planned to contribute to the business through her organizational skills and her ability to manage complex logistics, but she also hoped eventually to establish educational programs for the diverse population of workers and families who were building California's emerging economy. San Francisco in 1854 was a city of remarkable diversity and opportunity, where traditional social hierarchies were less rigidly enforced than in the established communities of the East Coast. William and Amara's arrival coincided with the height of the gold rush prosperity, and the city was full of people from every background and nationality, all focused more on individual capability than on conventional social credentials. Thomas's business arrangements proved to be even more promising than anticipated. The freight company needed partners with education, organizational skills, and the ability to manage complex transportation logistics across difficult terrain. William's Harvard education and his experience managing his father's business correspondence made him immediately valuable, while Amara's practical skills and her ability to communicate effectively with workers from diverse backgrounds quickly established her as an essential part of their operations. Within their first month in California, they had established themselves in a comfortable house in a neighborhood where mixed-race couples were not uncommon and where their relationship attracted no more attention than any other business partnership between capable individuals. "I keep waiting for someone to challenge our right to be here together," Amara confided as they sat on their front porch one evening, watching the fog roll in from San Francisco Bay. "Perhaps," William replied, "we've finally found a place where our capabilities matter more than other people's assumptions about who we're supposed to be." Their business success exceeded everyone's expectations, including their own. William's combination of education and determination, enhanced by his hard-won understanding of overcoming physical limitations, made him exceptionally effective at solving the logistical challenges of frontier transportation. Amara's organizational abilities and her talent for managing diverse work crews quickly established her as an invaluable partner in their expanding operations. But more than their professional success, what struck both of them was the gradual realization that they were living as equals in ways that had been impossible in Massachusetts. Here, their marriage was legally recognized, their partnership was professionally respected, and their relationship was socially accepted by their neighbors and business associates. "We did it," William said one morning, as they reviewed their business accounts and realized that their freight company had become profitable enough to consider expansion into additional routes and services. "We built something real," Amara agreed, "something that belongs to both of us equally." 6 months after their arrival in California, William wrote a long letter to his father, describing not just their business success, but the personal transformation they had both experienced through building a life based on equality and mutual respect. "Dear Father," the letter began, "I write to report that your investment in our California venture has been more successful than any of us dared hope, but more importantly, to share with you the realization that we have discovered something here that transcends mere business prosperity. Amara and I have built not just a successful freight operation, but a genuine partnership in which both our capabilities are fully utilized and respected. She manages our personnel and logistics with skills that any Harvard-trained businessman would envy, while I handle our financial planning and route development with an energy and enthusiasm that my former physical limitations never allowed me to imagine. But beyond our professional collaboration, we have created a marriage based on intellectual equality and emotional intimacy that I now understand was impossible within the constraints of Massachusetts society. Here we are simply two people who love each other and who work together to build something meaningful, rather than a scandalous arrangement that must be hidden and justified. I walk now, Father, not just in the physical sense, though my mobility continues to improve with each passing month, but in the broader sense of moving through the world as a complete person rather than as someone defined primarily by his limitations. Amara has given me not just the techniques for physical recovery, but the understanding that recovery means claiming the right to live according to my own capabilities rather than other people's expectations. I hope that you will consider visiting us here, both to see the business we've built and to understand the life we've created. I think you would find that your son has finally become the man you always hoped he could be, but in ways that neither of us could have imagined while we remained within the boundaries of conventional society. Thomas received the letter on a grey February morning in Massachusetts, and as he read his son's words, he felt a mixture of pride, relief, and something approaching envy for the freedom and authenticity that William and Amara had achieved. Their second year in California brought unexpected challenges that tested both their business partnership and their personal relationship. A severe winter had damaged several mountain passes, disrupting their transportation routes and forcing them to develop alternative strategies for maintaining their freight services. The crisis required them to work 18-hour days, managing not just their own operations, but coordinating with other transportation companies, mining operations, and merchant suppliers throughout Northern California. The physical and emotional demands of this period pushed both of them to their limits, but also demonstrated the strength of the partnership they had built. "I couldn't manage this without you," William told Amara one evening, as they reviewed damage reports and revised shipping schedules for the third time that week. "You wouldn't need to," she replied, "because you wouldn't have built something this complex and successful without our partnership from the beginning." Her response captured something essential about their relationship that had evolved far beyond the employer-employee dynamic where they had started. They had become genuine equals, each contributing different but equally valuable capabilities to both their business and their marriage. The winter crisis also brought them into contact with other couples who had created unconventional partnerships in California's more flexible social environment. They discovered a community of people who had chosen love and compatibility over social convention, creating a network of support and friendship that had been impossible in Massachusetts. "We're not as unusual here as we thought," Amara observed, after attending a dinner party where they met several other mixed-race couples, as well as partnerships that defied conventional expectations in other ways. "Perhaps," William replied, "we've found our way to a place where being unusual is considered an asset rather than a problem." By spring, they had not only survived the winter crisis, but emerged from it with expanded operations and enhanced reputation throughout the California transportation industry. Their ability to solve complex logistical problems under pressure had established them as leaders in their field, and their business was receiving inquiries about partnerships and expansion opportunities throughout the Western Territories. "We've built something bigger than we originally planned," William said as they reviewed proposals for extending their services into Nevada and Oregon. "We've built something that matches the scale of what we're capable of achieving together," Amara replied, "rather than limiting ourselves to what we thought we were allowed to attempt." In their third year in California, William and Amara received news that vindicated every risk they had taken and every conventional boundary they had crossed. Thomas wrote to inform them that Dr. Morrison, the Boston physician who had examined William before their departure, was requesting permission to document William's recovery as a medical case study for publication in professional journals. "Dr. Morrison wishes to feature your case as an example of how determination, proper therapeutic techniques, and supportive environment can achieve recovery that was previously considered impossible," Thomas's letter explained. "He attributes your success to innovative self-directed therapy and strong family support, but his description of your achievements has generated considerable interest among medical professionals throughout New England." The irony was profound. The medical establishment that had declared William's condition hopeless was now seeking to claim credit for a recovery that had been achieved through love, partnership, and the rejection of medical limitations rather than through conventional treatment. "They want to study your success," Amara said as they discussed the letter, "but they would never acknowledge the actual methods that made it possible." "Let them study whatever they can understand," William replied, "as long as they don't interfere with what we've actually built." Their response to Thomas was polite but clear. They would be happy to provide general information about William's recovery for medical research, but they would not return to Massachusetts for examination or detailed consultation. Their life was in California now, built around the partnership and equality that had made William's recovery possible in the first place. The medical interest in William's case brought unexpected attention to their California business as well. Their success story began attracting investors and partners who were interested in both their transportation expertise and their reputation for achieving supposedly impossible results through innovative approaches. "We're becoming famous," Amara observed with some amusement, "for doing exactly what society told us we couldn't do." "Perhaps," William replied, "that's the best possible vindication for trusting ourselves rather than accepting other people's limitations." Their success had created opportunities to help other people who were challenging social conventions or overcoming physical limitations, and they began using their business platform to provide employment and support for individuals who might not find acceptance in more traditional environments. By 1857, William and Amara had built more than just a successful business. They had created a model for how genuine partnership could transcend social boundaries and achieve results that neither individual could have accomplished alone. Their freight company had become one of the largest transportation operations in Northern California, but more importantly, it had become known for its innovative approaches to solving complex problems and its commitment to treating all employees as valuable contributors, regardless of their background. Their marriage had evolved into something that served as an inspiration for other couples who were challenging conventional social expectations. They had demonstrated that love based on intellectual equality and mutual respect could not only survive social disapproval, but could thrive in ways that more conventional relationships might never achieve. "Sometimes I think about who we would have been if we had stayed in Massachusetts," Amara said one evening as they sat together on their expanded front porch, watching the sunset over San Francisco Bay. "I would have remained an invalid, gradually disappearing into comfortable despair," William replied without hesitation, "and you would have remained invisible, your capabilities unrecognized and unutilized. Instead, we became ourselves," she said, taking his hand in the gesture that had marked the beginning of their partnership years earlier. Their personal transformation had also influenced their extended family relationships. Thomas had visited them twice, and each visit had deepened his understanding of what his son had achieved through choosing love over social convention. He had returned to Massachusetts as an advocate for more flexible social attitudes and had used his business influence to support other unconventional relationships and innovative approaches to social challenges. "Your father has become quite the reformer," Amara observed after receiving his latest letter, which described his efforts to support educational opportunities for free black families in Massachusetts. "You changed more than just my life," William replied. "You changed his understanding of what's possible when people are judged by their capabilities rather than their circumstances." Their success had also attracted attention from other reformers and social innovators throughout California and the Western Territories. They had become part of a network of people who were building new kinds of communities based on equality, opportunity, and respect for individual capabilities rather than traditional social hierarchies. "We helped prove that a different kind of society is possible," William said, as they prepared to attend a gathering of California business leaders and social reformers. "We proved it to ourselves," Amara replied, "and that turned out to be enough to prove it to everyone else who was ready to see." In 1858, William achieved something that would have been unimaginable during his years of physical limitation in Massachusetts. He completed a 3-day horseback journey through the Sierra Nevada mountains to establish a new freight route between their San Francisco operations and the expanding mining territories of Nevada. The journey was both a practical business necessity and a profound personal statement. The young man, who had been confined to a wheelchair for most of his life, was now capable of extended physical activity in some of the most challenging terrain in North America. But more significantly, He was doing so as an equal partner with Amara, rather than as someone who needed to be accommodated or protected. 5 years ago, he told Amara, as they camped beside a mountain stream on the second night of their journey, I couldn't imagine walking across a room. Now we're traveling together through wilderness that most people would consider dangerous and difficult. 5 years ago, she replied, I couldn't imagine being treated as an equal partner in any significant endeavor. Now we're building transportation routes that will serve thousands of people throughout the Western Territories. Their conversation beside the campfire captured the magnitude of the transformation they had both experienced. They had evolved from a desperate young man trapped by physical limitations and a talented woman constrained by social prejudices into genuine partners who were building something significant together. The success of their mountain expedition opened new business opportunities that established them as leaders in California's expanding economy, but it also provided them with a sense of personal accomplishment that transcended mere commercial success. They had proved to themselves that no limitation, whether physical or social, was powerful enough to prevent determined people from achieving their goals. We did more than overcome our individual challenges, William observed, as they returned to San Francisco after successfully establishing their new route. We discovered how to become more than the sum of what we could have achieved separately. Their partnership had evolved into something that served as a model for other people who were challenging conventional boundaries, and their success had created opportunities to support and mentor others who were pursuing unconventional paths toward personal and professional fulfillment. In the autumn of 1858, William and Amara received news that forced them to confront their past in ways they had never expected. Mrs. Henderson wrote to inform them that Thomas had suffered a serious stroke and was requesting their immediate return to Massachusetts to assist with urgent family business matters. The request placed them in an impossible situation. Thomas needed their help, and their love and loyalty to him demanded that they respond to his crisis. But returning to Massachusetts meant re-entering a social environment that would refuse to recognize their marriage and might actively threaten their safety as an interracial couple. We have to go, William said, as they discussed the situation in their San Francisco home, surrounded by the life they had built based on equality and mutual respect. He supported us when no one else would, and we can't abandon him when he needs our help. I know, Amara replied, but we also can't pretend that returning to Massachusetts won't require us to step back into roles and restrictions that we've outgrown. Their decision to return east was complicated by the practical realities of their California business, which required ongoing management and couldn't simply be abandoned for an indefinite period. They ultimately decided that William would travel to Massachusetts immediately to address the crisis, while Amara would remain in California to maintain their operations until they could determine the extent of Thomas's needs and the duration of their involvement. The separation was the first significant test of their relationship since their marriage, requiring them to function independently while maintaining their partnership across the continent. Their daily telegraph correspondence became a lifeline that sustained their connection despite the physical distance and the different challenges each of them was facing. William's return to Massachusetts was jarring in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Harrington estate seemed smaller and more constrained than he remembered, and the social expectations that had once defined his entire existence now felt artificial and restrictive after years of California freedom. Thomas's condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, and his primary need was for someone with business expertise to manage his various investments and properties while he recovered. But more than practical assistance, Thomas seemed to need emotional support from someone who understood the transformation he had undergone through supporting his son's unconventional choices. I keep thinking about what I almost lost, Thomas told William during one of their quiet evenings together. Not just you, but the opportunity to see you become the man you were always capable of being. William's extended stay in Massachusetts created opportunities for conversations with his father that revealed how profoundly Thomas's perspective had changed through supporting his son's relationship with Amara. Thomas had gradually become an advocate for social reform in ways that surprised both of them, using his business influence to support educational opportunities and economic advancement for Black families throughout New England. Watching you and Amara build your life together taught me something I hadn't understood before, Thomas explained as they reviewed his various charitable investments. Real strength comes from recognizing capability wherever it exists, not from maintaining artificial barriers that prevent people from contributing their talents. Thomas's stroke had been caused partly by the stress of defending his son's choices against social criticism from business associates and family friends, who considered William's marriage a scandal that reflected poorly on the Harrington family reputation. But rather than regretting his support, Thomas had become more committed to challenging the social conventions that created such conflicts. "I've lost some business relationships," Thomas admitted, "but I've gained something more valuable, the respect of people whose opinions actually matter, and the knowledge that I supported something genuinely important rather than simply maintaining comfortable prejudices." William's letters to Amara during this period described his growing appreciation for his father's courage and his increasing desire to return to California, where they could continue building their life together without the constraints that Massachusetts society continued to impose. "Father has become a stronger advocate for equality than either of us expected," he wrote, "but I also realize that California is our home now, the place where we can be ourselves completely, rather than constantly managing other people's expectations." After 2 months in Massachusetts, William had successfully stabilized Thomas's business affairs and established management systems that would allow his father to recover without requiring ongoing assistance. But more importantly, he had recognized that his life was in California with Amara, building something new rather than maintaining something from the past. "I need to return to my real life," he told Thomas as they prepared for his departure back to California, "and my real life is with Amara, building our partnership and our business in a place where both are fully recognized and respected." Thomas embraced his son with understanding and pride, recognizing that William's eagerness to return to California represented not rejection of family connections, but commitment to the authentic life he had created through love and determination. William's return to San Francisco in December 1858 was a celebration not just of reunion with Amara, but of recommitment to the life they had built together, based on equality and mutual respect. During their separation, both of them had gained deeper appreciation for the partnership they had created and the unique environment in California that allowed their relationship to flourish. "I managed the business successfully while you were gone," Amara reported as they reviewed their operations together, "but I also realized how much our partnership means beyond mere practical efficiency. We accomplish more together, not just because we divide the work, but because we inspire each other to attempt things neither of us would dare to try alone." William's experience in Massachusetts had reinforced his understanding that their life in California represented more than just geographical relocation. It represented a fundamental transformation of identity that had allowed both of them to become the people they were truly capable of being. "Massachusetts felt like visiting a museum of who we used to be," he told Amara as they walked together through their San Francisco neighborhood, surrounded by the diverse community that had become their chosen family. "California is where we live, as who we actually are." Their reunion also brought new business opportunities that had developed during William's absence. Their reputation for innovative problem-solving and ethical business practices had attracted investors who were interested in expanding their transportation services into new territories throughout the western United States. "We've been invited to establish operations in Oregon, Nevada, and potentially Colorado," Amara reported excitedly. "Our success has created opportunities to build something even larger than we originally imagined." But more than business expansion, what excited both of them was the possibility of continuing to serve as an example for other people who were challenging social conventions or overcoming personal limitations. Their success had demonstrated that love, determination, and mutual respect could overcome seemingly impossible barriers. "We've proved that different kinds of partnerships are not only possible, but can be more successful than traditional arrangements," William observed as they planned their future expansion. "Perhaps that's the most valuable legacy we can create." Their relationship had evolved into something that transcended their original circumstances, while honoring the courage and determination that had made their transformation possible in the first place. By 1859, William and Amara had achieved something remarkable. They had built not just a successful business and a loving marriage, but a model for how genuine partnership could transcend social barriers and create opportunities that benefit entire communities. Their transportation company had become one of the largest and most respected operations in the Western Territories, known for its innovative approaches to complex logistical challenges and its commitment to treating all employees with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. But more importantly, their business had become a pathway for other people who were seeking opportunities to develop their capabilities despite social barriers or personal limitations. Their marriage had evolved into a partnership that inspired other couples who were challenging conventional social expectations, demonstrating that relationships based on intellectual equality and mutual respect could not only survive social disapproval, but could thrive in ways that more traditional arrangements might never achieve. Sometimes I think about that first morning when you suggested I take my reading outside to the garden, William said as they sat together on the porch of their expanded California home, watching the sunset over San Francisco Bay. Neither of us could have imagined that such a simple suggestion would lead to all of this. It wasn't the suggestion that changed everything, Amara replied, taking his hand in the gesture that had marked so many significant moments in their relationship. It was your willingness to trust me enough to try something different, and my willingness to see you as someone capable of growth, rather than someone defined by limitations. Their success had created opportunities to support other people who were pursuing unconventional paths toward personal and professional fulfillment, and their story had become part of the growing movement towards social equality and individual opportunity that was beginning to transform American society. Thomas visited them regularly, and each visit deepened his pride in what his son had achieved through choosing love over social convention. He had become an advocate for reform in Massachusetts, using his business influence to support educational opportunities and economic advancement for marginalized communities throughout New England. You changed more than just your own lives, he told them during his most recent visit. You changed my understanding of what's possible when people are judged by their character and capabilities rather than their circumstances. As they looked toward the future, William and Amara saw not just continued business success and personal happiness, but opportunities to contribute to the ongoing transformation of American society toward greater equality and individual opportunity. We helped prove that a different kind of life is possible, William said as they prepared to attend a gathering of California reformers and innovators. We proved it to ourselves, Amara replied, and that turned out to be enough to prove it to everyone else who was ready to believe in something better. AST, their love story had become a testament to the power of seeing beyond social limitations to recognize the infinite possibilities that exist when two people choose to build something together based on mutual respect, intellectual equality, and unwavering commitment to each other's growth and happiness. The young man who had never walked, and the woman who had never been seen as an equal, had discovered that love, determination, and partnership could overcome any barrier that society might construct, creating not just personal fulfillment, but lasting change that would benefit generations to come. If this incredible true story of love conquering impossible odds touched your heart and made you believe in the power of determination and genuine partnership, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories that prove miracles happen when we refuse to accept limitations. Write in the comments below, what impossible dream are you working toward in your own life? Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear that transformation is always possible. And tell us where you're watching from around the world. We love connecting with our global community of dreamers and believers. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries, keep believing in love, and keep proving that anything is possible when two hearts work together towards something greater than themselves.